So I'm Paulette-team. I'm the Vice President for Community Health Centers at Harbor Health Services in Boston. Early on, when I looked at the standards, I realized there was nobody in the organization that would contact experts on any of the one standards. So I knew it needed to be a group process. So I put together a group. There were about 25 people. We met every 2 weeks for the better part of 18 months. The approach I used was for each standard, I assigned a senior person and one of the middle managers at the health centers. And they were responsible for that standard. And what we did is for each standard, it was presented 3 times through the 18-month process. First, an initial assessment, followed by discussion at that meeting about what other people could contribute. We brought it back a second time about 6 months later, so that they could represent, here's what we've learned, here's what we've identified as problem areas. And again, it was brought back another 6 months later for a final read, and where we would do our own self-scoring. It was important that people owned the standards, because that gets people engaged in a way that just general discussion doesn't get people engaged. And so the process worked for us. It accomplished a couple things for me. This is at a time when the health centers were working pretty independently, and I purposely teamed people up from across sites. So they got to know other people in the sites, which was helpful. And I purposely assigned people to standards in areas where they were probably less comfortable. So for example, one of the executives, at the time, the executive director, who was a nurse, I did not assign her the first standard on access. I assigned it to an executive director who was not a nurse, because it forced him to get involved and to understand some of the processes at a different level. That has served us well as we've actually gone into practice transformation. People are better informed about our daily practice, where there's variation, what we need to improve.
Okay. I was assigned to what was then Standard 8, which is essentially the performance measurement and improvement standard. And the senior manager who was in that team with me was Dr. Bob Hawk, who is our Chief Medical Officer, and he's also the supervisor of our QI department. So mostly, actually, in the case of this particular standard, I did most of the day-to-day work, that is, looking at the standard and saying, here are the documentation that we need, and I would bring all those materials to him and we would review it together before we presented to the larger team. That was different from the way it worked with a lot of the other standards, because we were already, that was probably the standard where we were already closest to meeting all the elements and doing them. It was really more a question of how are we going to demonstrate this, which conditions or which reports are we going to pick, and how are we going to write this up, and what projects are we going to highlight, and so forth.
What she's saying is the standard that was assigned to her is really the everyday work that she does and that Bob Hawk supervises. In the other standards, that was not necessarily true. And so the other groups had to go out. So I'll use the first standard, on access. And it was assigned to David Reddy from Mid-Upper Cape. David did not have any daily working knowledge about the access to, elements and how we were going to meet it. So between this larger group meeting that he had to come back every 6 months, he had to have small working group meetings, bring together the nurse managers from the 3 sites and say, okay, how are we going to demonstrate that we ensure access for a patient? So there was a lot of that, small groups. Definitely most of the work was done outside the setting of this large group meeting that happened every 2 weeks. And what the large group meeting was at gave structure to people. Here's your deadline. Here's when you have to be prepared. So it helped keep people moving forward.